Okay, get ready, because today we are diving deep into Leviticus 13.
Well, yeah.
A chapter of the Bible that you might not think is that interesting, but trust me, it gets pretty fascinating.
It does.
Because it gets really specific about skin diseases.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, an ancient medical textbook. But with some really intriguing twists and turns, as we're going to find out.
Yeah, absolutely.
You got the source material right here.
Yeah.
So get ready to uncover how the ancient Israelites approached these conditions and what it tells us about their society as a whole.
It's so fascinating to think about this chapter in light of what we know about, public health today.
Right.
This was a time way before microscopes, germ theory.
None of that.
And yet they were already developing these systems to manage, what they were observing.
Yeah, and they didn't just have a vague idea of skin problems. Leviticus 13 lays out this really detailed system for identifying and categorizing all these different conditions, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just, you have a rash.
Right.
They're looking at the appearance, the color, the location, even changes in hair associated with these ailments.
It's really a testament to their powers of observation.
Yeah.
They differentiated between a superficial bright spot on the skin and one that went deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And white hair was a really significant indicator of a more serious issue. So it speaks to a nuanced understanding of, how these conditions could manifest.
Yeah, it's really making me think about how, their whole understanding of the body might have been different from our own, what we might call a symptom.
Mm-hmm.
They might have seen as a core part of the condition itself.
That's a great point. And their framework for understanding these conditions was likely shaped by their cultural and religious beliefs, which, we'll dive into a little bit later. Yeah. But first, let's talk about what happened, after a diagnosis. They weren't just identifying these conditions for the sake of it.
Right. This is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Because, they had procedures for isolating people with certain skin conditions, essentially what we would call quarantine today. But what I find so fascinating is they weren't just isolating anyone with any sort of skin problem.
Mm-hmm.
The priests, acting as both medical and religious authorities, determined who was clean or unclean, and for how long.
And that points to a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of contagiousness.
Right.
Even if they didn't, know about germs the way we do today.
Yeah.
They were clearly observing patterns of transmission and, taking steps to mitigate the spread of disease within their community.
I'm really curious about those pronouncements of clean and unclean. It seems like those terms carry a lot of weight, going way beyond just a medical diagnosis, right?
Absolutely.
So what were the implications of being declared unclean in this context?
That's a crucial question.
Yeah.
And it goes to the heart of how, Leviticus 13 intertwined medical practice with their social and religious structures.
Mm-hmm.
Being labeled unclean wasn't just about physical health.
Okay.
It had profound social and spiritual ramifications.
So it wasn't just a matter of stay home until you feel better.
Not at all.
Okay.
It meant being separated from the community, excluded from religious rituals.
Oh, wow.
And potentially facing significant stigma.
Wow.
Yeah, it really highlights how their understanding of health and illness was woven into the very fabric of their society.
Yeah, imagine dealing with a skin condition, and then on top of that, you have to deal with social isolation.
Right.
That's a lot.
Yeah. It's a stark reminder that, for the ancient Israelites, physical health, spiritual purity, and social belonging were all intertwined. And to understand Leviticus 13, we need to grapple with those interconnected layers of meaning.
So while we might be tempted to, focus on the specifics of the skin conditions themselves, it sounds like the real story here is about how these diagnoses played out in their society.
Exactly. The details of, the bright spots and the swellings are fascinating.
Yeah.
But what's truly compelling is how they illuminate, the ancient Israelites' beliefs about the body, community, and the divine.
It makes you wonder, were there ever instances where the priests' roles as, medical and religious authorities that's come into conflict?
Yeah.
Did their beliefs ever influence their decisions about who was clean or unclean?
That's an insightful question, and one that historians continue to debate.
Yeah.
The text itself doesn't explicitly address such conflicts, but it's certainly a possibility worth exploring as we delve deeper into the social implications of these practices.
Okay, so we've got this fascinating system for diagnosing skin conditions, the implications of being declared unclean.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's one more detail in Leviticus 13 that really caught my eye.
Okay.
They didn't just focus on people.
Right.
There's a whole section about infected garments.
Yeah, it's like they were recognizing that certain materials could harbor and spread disease, even if they didn't understand the exact mechanisms at play.
Yeah, so it wasn't just about, like, personal hygiene. It was about preventing transmission through objects, too.
Right.
Talk about a comprehensive approach.
Their attention to detail is striking.
Yeah.
You know, they even had different rules depending on the material. It suggests a deep understanding of how different fabrics and substances might interact with these conditions.
It makes you wonder, like, how did they arrive at these practices?
Right.
Was it purely observation, trial and error, or maybe some combination of both?
Right.
And were these rules, like, universally followed?
Yeah.
Or were there variations in how different communities applied them?
Those are excellent questions.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we don't have all the answers.
Right.
The text itself doesn't provide, like, a detailed account of how these practices developed.
Okay.
However, you know, we can analyze Leviticus 13 within the broader context of ancient Israelite law and culture to gain insights into their motivations and the potential social dynamics at play.
Okay, so we've got this fascinating system for diagnosing skin conditions, the implications of being declared unclean,
Right.
and even rules for handling infected garments.
Yeah.
I'm really eager to unpack all of this further
Yeah.
and explore how these practices impacted the lives of individuals and families
Absolutely.
in their communities.
Let's dive in.
Okay.
I think you'll find that Leviticus 13, while seemingly focused on a specific set of conditions, really opens a window into the very heart of ancient Israelite society.
All right, let's do it.
Okay.
We've been talking about how heavy it was, you know, like socially and spiritually, to be declared unclean in ancient Israel.
Yeah.
And it just seems like such a different way of thinking about illness than we do now, you know, in modern times.
It really is. You know,
Yeah.
today we tend to view illness through like a biological lens.
Right.
You know, focusing on the causes, the symptoms, and the treatments. But for the ancient Israelites, illness was like deeply intertwined with their understanding of like the divine morality and social order.
So it wasn't just about treating the physical symptoms. It was like about restoring a person's place within the community and their relationship with God.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that process of like restoration involved this complex set of rituals and practices all outlined in Leviticus.
Yeah.
It wasn't simply a matter of, you know, taking medicine and waiting to get better.
Right.
It was about purification, atonement, and reintegration.
It makes you wonder how people coped with this system.
Yeah.
Especially those who were, you know, repeatedly labeled unclean.
Right.
Did they, like, internalize these labels? Did they ever, like, challenge the pronouncements of the priests?
Right.
How did families, you know, navigate the social and economic burdens of isolation?
Those are excellent questions.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the text itself doesn't, you know, give us a whole lot of insight into the personal experiences of those affected.
Right.
We can, however, you know, analyze the broader social structures and draw inferences from other historical sources to kind of piece together a more nuanced understanding.
So while we might not have like those firsthand accounts,
Right.
we can still try to imagine what it would have been like to live under this system.
Absolutely.
Right.
And that act of imagining, of trying to like step into the shoes of people who lived thousands of years ago can be like incredibly powerful.
Wow.
You know, it challenges us to confront our own assumptions and to see the world through a different lens.
Speaking of different lenses, I'm curious about like the ancient Israelites' understanding of the causes of these skin conditions.
Yeah.
Did they attribute them to like specific behaviors or environmental factors,
Right.
or maybe even supernatural forces?
That's a key question.
Yeah.
While Leviticus doesn't like delve into the causes the way, you know, we might think about it today.
Yeah.
There's no mention of, you know, germs or bacteria, for instance. It's clear that they saw these conditions as potentially stemming from spiritual impurity.
So getting a skin condition wasn't just bad luck.
Right.
It could be seen as a sign of like a strained relationship with God.
That's a crucial insight.
Yeah.
For the ancient Israelites, health, purity, and religious observance were all interconnected. Right.
Being unclean meant being separated from God.
Wow.
Which was like a profound concept for them.
It adds a whole new dimension to the idea of healing.
Right.
It wasn't just about like restoring physical health, but also restoring like spiritual wholeness.
Right.
And right relationship with the community and with the divine.
Exactly. And that process of, restoration often involves sacrifices, offerings, and rituals of purification, all overseen by the priests. Yeah. It was a deeply communal process, emphasizing the interconnectedness of the individual in the community.
Yeah, it seems like these practices were like deeply rooted in their beliefs about like the nature of the cosmos. The role of humanity and the importance of ritual purity.
Right.
It's so different from our modern, like, secularized understanding of health and illness.
Yeah, but even though we may not share their worldview,
I think there's something profound about recognizing the ways in which they sought to understand and address these challenges within their own cultural framework.
I agree. It's a reminder that, like, our understanding of health and disease is always shaped by our cultural beliefs and practices.
Absolutely.
Like what we consider normal or abnormal, clean or unclean, is often influenced by the values and assumptions of our time.
And that realization can be both humbling and liberating. It challenges us to question our own assumptions and to approach different perspectives with curiosity and respect.
We've been focusing a lot on the social and spiritual implications of these practices.
Right.
But I'm also curious about like the more practical side of things.
Yeah.
How effective were these practices in actually preventing the spread of disease?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
While we can't, definitively measure their success by modern standards.
Right.
There's evidence to suggest that these practices, along with, other hygiene laws outlined in Leviticus, did contribute to better public health outcomes for the ancient Israelites.
So even though they didn't have like the same scientific understanding that we do today, their observations and practices were in many ways like remarkably effective.
Precisely. Yeah. They were working with, the knowledge they had.
Right.
And they were actively trying to create a system that protected their community from harm.
Right.
And in that sense, I think, we can learn a lot from their approach.
It reminds me of that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention.
Right.
They face like a real threat from these conditions.
Yeah.
And they develop these like creative solutions based on what they observed.
And those solutions, while sometimes, seemingly strange or even harsh from a modern perspective, were ultimately rooted in a deep concern for the well-being of the community.
It's making me think about how we approach like public health challenges today. We have access to, so much more knowledge and technology.
Yeah.
And yet we still struggle with issues like, disease outbreaks, antibiotic resistance, and health disparities.
It's a reminder that, even with all of our advancements, there's still a lot we can learn from the past.
Right.
Not necessarily, in the specifics of their practices, but in their spirit of observation, adaptation, and community care.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the intricate details of ancient skin conditions to the broader social and spiritual implications of being labeled unclean.
Right.
But there's one more aspect of Leviticus 13 that I want to touch on before we wrap up.
Okay.
And that's the concept of like different levels of severity.
Right.
They didn't just lump all skin conditions together. They recognized like nuances and variations.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that attention to detail is fascinating.
Yeah.
For example, they differentiated between infections that arose spontaneously and those that developed in like pre-existing wounds, like burns or boils.
So location mattered.
In a way, yeah.
Right.
It considered more serious to have like a bright spot appear out of nowhere, versus in an area that was already injured. I think in a way, yes.
Okay.
They seem to recognize that infections arising in like compromised skin might be more serious or have like different implications for transmission.
Okay.
It suggests a deeper understanding of, how the body's defenses work, even if they didn't have like the language of immunology that we do today.
Yeah, it's like they were starting to grasp the concept of like vulnerability, like how certain conditions could make you more susceptible to illness.
Absolutely.
It's another example of how Leviticus 13, goes beyond simple rules. And reveals a nuanced understanding of how disease works within the context of the body and the environment.
And that understanding, I think, is what makes this chapter so compelling.
Yeah.
It's not just a set of like ancient regulations.
Right.
It's a window into how the ancient Israelites grappled with these fundamental questions about health, disease, and the very nature of human existence.
Okay, so we've delved into the diagnostic system, the social and spiritual ramifications of being declared unclean,
right?
The rules for handling contaminated objects,
right?
And even their understanding of different levels of severity.
Yeah.
What does all of this tell us about the ancient Israelites and their approach to health and illness?
I think it paints a picture of a society that was like deeply attuned to the interconnectedness of the physical, the spiritual, and the communal. They saw illness not just as like a biological phenomenon, but as something that could like disrupt the social and cosmic order.
And their response to these disruptions wasn't just about treating the individual,
right,
but about restoring like balance and harmony within the community and your relationship with the divine.
Exactly. And while their specific practices may seem, foreign to us today,
right,
I think there's something deeply resonant about their understanding of health as like a holistic concept, encompassing not just the body, but the mind, the spirit, and the community.
It's wild to think that all of this stuff we've been talking about, like all these practices that are laid out in Leviticus 13,
right,
these were happening like thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
Makes you realize like these concerns about health and disease, they're like a constant throughout human history.
It really does, and while the specifics of, how they approach things might be different from how we do things today, that underlying impulse to understand, manage, and even, try to control those threats,
right,
it's something we can all relate to, even today.
Absolutely. And it's not just about like the practicalities of like, okay, how do we prevent an outbreak?
Right.
As we've been saying, Leviticus 13 like goes so much deeper. It really reveals like how the ancient Israelites thought about purity, the role of the priesthood, and like the connection between the individual, the community, and the divine.
Exactly. It's a reminder that our understanding of health and illness, it's always shaped by our cultural and religious frameworks.
Right.
What we consider normal or abnormal, it's often just a reflection of our own values and beliefs.
Makes me wonder though, like how they reconciled, their beliefs about like divine power and God's power with like the very real suffering that was caused by these skin conditions.
Yeah.
Did they like see illness as a punishment or was it like a test of faith?
That's a really complex question.
Yeah.
And one that scholars, are still debating.
Okay.
The text itself doesn't give us a simple answer.
Right.
There are passages that suggest a connection between sin and illness.
Okay.
But there are also instances where, suffering is portrayed as like a test or a catalyst for spiritual growth.
So it's not like a straightforward cause and effect.
Right.
It's more nuanced than that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that even within a single culture,
right,
there can be all sorts of different interpretations and responses to these big questions about the nature of illness and suffering.
We've been looking at Leviticus 13 from all these different angles, the medical side, the social side, the spiritual side.
Right.
But I'm also really struck by like the human element of it all.
Yeah.
Imagine like the anxiety of waiting for the priest's pronouncement, the isolation of being declared unclean.
Yeah.
The hope associated with like those rituals of purification.
It's so important to remember that behind all these rules and regulations, we're talking about real people grappling with very real fears and hopes.
Yeah.
Their lives were like directly impacted by these pronouncements of clean and unclean.
It's easy to get caught up in like the academic analysis of these ancient texts, but we shouldn't lose sight of like those individual stories that are woven into them.
I totally agree. And as we continue to study and learn from Leviticus 13, I think it's so important to approach it with both intellectual rigor and a sense of empathy.
Right.
These were real people facing real challenges. And their responses, you know, however different from our own, deserve our respect and our understanding.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Leviticus 13, what stands out to you as like the biggest takeaway? Like what's the one thing you really hope our listeners will remember from this whole conversation?
You know, for me, it's the realization that even a topic that seems, you know, kind of niche, like ancient skin conditions, it can reveal these really profound insights into a culture's worldview, values, and social structures. You know, Leviticus 13, it isn't just about disease. It's about how a society grappled with like these huge questions about purity, identity, and the relationship between humanity and the divine.
And it's a reminder that our own understanding of health and illness, like we've been talking about, it's shaped by our own cultural context.
Absolutely.
You know, we may have different explanations and different treatments today. But that basic human desire to understand, manage, and even conquer these threats. It's timeless.
It really is. And as we continue to face, you know, new health challenges in our own time.
Maybe there are lessons to be learned from those who came before us. Not necessarily, you know, in the specifics of what they did. But in their spirit of observation, adaptation, and this idea that health isn't just an individual concern. It's a matter of collective responsibility.
So Leviticus 13, a chapter that, you know, at first glance you might think is just about this very narrow set of medical conditions. Really takes us on this incredible journey.
It does.
Through history, culture, and really like the very essence of what it means to be human.
It's a testament to the power of really digging deep. Of going beneath the surface to uncover those hidden connections and complexities that are there.
And it leaves us with this really like thought-provoking question. What other seemingly niche topics might hold these really surprising like relevance for us today?
Exactly.
And what can we learn from those who came before us as we face, you know, the always changing landscape of health and illness in our own time?
A great question to think about. And on that note, I think we're going to wrap up our deep dive here.
That's good.
Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep on learning.